I still remember the exact weight of silence in the room when I first spoke those words to him. "The ledger is wrong," I whispered, and the Duke of Hartwell laughed as though I had told him the sky was falling. That laugh haunts me still, not because it was cruel, though it was, but because I can trace the entire arc of my life from that single moment. Everything I believed about myself, about love, about the quiet dignity of truth, was forged in the echo of his dismissal. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me begin where all such stories must begin, at the threshold of a house that would change me forever. I arrived at Ravenswood Manor on the 7th of October, in the year of our Lord 1842. The autumn rain had turned the roads to rivers of mud, and by the time the carriage deposited me at the servants' entrance, my hem was ruined and my spirit dampened in equal measure. I carried with me a single trunk containing everything I owned in this world: 3 dresses of modest cut, my father's ledger books, a miniature portrait of my mother, and the marriage certificate that proved I had once been Mrs. Vivian Ashby, wife to a man who had gambled away every penny of my dowry before dying of fever in a debtor's lodging house. I was 24 years old. I had been a wife for 2 years and a widow for 1, and I had learned in that brief and brutal education that the world held no mercy for women who trusted the wrong men. The housekeeper who greeted me was a stern woman named Mrs. Pemberton, with iron-gray hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch the skin of her temples. She looked at me with the particular disdain reserved for those who exist in the uncomfortable space between servant and gentlewoman. I was neither fish nor fowl, you see, too educated to scrub floors, too poor to sit in drawing rooms. My father had been a respected accountant, trusted by merchants and minor nobility alike, and he had taught me everything he knew. Numbers were my inheritance, the only dowry that could not be squandered by a reckless husband. Mrs. Pemberton led me through the servants' corridors, past the kitchen where the smell of roasting meat made my empty stomach clench, and up a narrow staircase to a small room tucked beneath the eaves. It was clean but sparse, with a single window that looked out over the east gardens. A writing desk had been placed near that window, and upon it sat a candle, a pot of ink, and a stack of ledgers so tall it seemed to lean like a drunken man. "Your domain," Mrs. Pemberton said, and I could not tell if the word was meant as mockery or simple fact. "His Grace expects the quarterly accounts reconciled by month's end. The previous keeper of accounts left rather suddenly, and there is much work to be done." I wanted to ask why the previous keeper had left, but something in the set of her mouth warned me against curiosity. Instead, I thanked her and waited until her footsteps had faded down the corridor before I allowed myself to sit upon the narrow bed and weep. I did not weep for long. I had learned that tears were a luxury I could not afford, and self-pity an even greater extravagance. So I dried my eyes, unpacked my trunk, and set myself to examining the ledgers that would occupy my days. The household accounts of Ravenswood Manor were a labyrinth. Whoever had kept them before me had possessed either a disordered mind or a deliberate intent to obscure. Entries were missing dates, sums were recorded without corresponding purchases, and entire pages seemed to have been removed and replaced with fresh paper. I worked through the night, my candle burning down to a stub, my eyes straining in the dim light, and by dawn I had mapped the shape of the confusion, even if I could not yet understand its cause. It was 3 days before I saw the Duke. I had begun to think of him as a ghost, a presence felt but never seen. The servants spoke of him in hushed tones, always His Grace this and His Grace that, but never by name and never with warmth. I learned that he was 32 years old, that he had inherited the title 5 years prior upon the death of his father, and that he had never married despite the persistent efforts of every ambitious mother in the county. I learned that he spent most of his time in the East Wing, which was forbidden to all but his valet and his elderly aunt, the Dowager Lady Hartwell. And I learned, though no one said it directly, that he was a man to be feared. On the 4th morning of my employment, I received a summons to the study. The study of the Duke of Hartwell was a room designed to intimidate. Dark wood paneling absorbed the weak autumn light, and heavy velvet curtains the color of dried blood-framed windows that looked out over grounds shrouded in mist. A fire burned in the massive hearth, but it did little to warm the air, which seemed to carry a permanent chill. And there, behind a desk large enough to serve as a dining table, sat the man who would become both my tormentor and my salvation. He did not look up when I entered. He was reading a letter, his brow furrowed in concentration, and for a long moment I stood in silence, studying him as one might study an adversary before a duel. He was tall. I could see that even with him seated, with broad shoulders and dark hair touched with premature silver at the temples. His features were severe rather than handsome, a strong jaw, a nose that had perhaps been broken once, eyes the color of winter slate. He wore no expression at all, his face as closed and guarded as a locked door. "You are the new accounts keeper," he said at last, and it was not a question. His voice was deep and cold, devoid of any warmth or welcome. "I am, Your Grace," I replied, keeping my own voice steady through an act of will. "Mrs. Vivian Caldwell." His eyes lifted then, and I felt the weight of his gaze like a physical pressure. He looked at me the way one might look at an insect that had crawled across one's breakfast plate, with distaste barely concealed beneath a veneer of aristocratic boredom. "Caldwell," he repeated. "I was told you were a widow, that your name was Ashby." "It was," I said. "I have chosen to reclaim my maiden name." Something flickered in his eyes, too quick to name. "Ah," he said, "one of those marriages, then." I felt heat rise to my cheeks, but I refused to look away. "My marriage is not a matter for discussion, Your Grace. I am here to manage your accounts, nothing more." For a moment I thought he might dismiss me on the spot. No one spoke to the Duke of Hartwell in such a manner, I would learn later. No one dared. But instead of anger, I saw something else cross his face. Something that might have been surprise or perhaps the faintest glimmer of respect. "Very well, Mrs. Caldwell," he said. "Manage my accounts then. I expect a full report by the end of the month. Do not disappoint me." It was a dismissal, clear and cold, and I should have taken it. I should have curtsied and retreated to my little room beneath the eaves and lost myself in the safe world of numbers and columns. But something made me pause at the door, some instinct that would prove to be either my salvation or my ruin. "Your Grace," I said, turning back to face him. "The ledgers are in considerable disarray. It will take time to understand what has been recorded and what has been omitted. But I should tell you now that there appear to be discrepancies." His expression did not change, but I saw his hand tighten almost imperceptibly around the letter he still held. "Discrepancies," he repeated. "Yes, Your Grace, sums that do not reconcile. Entries that seem to reference purchases or payments for which there is no corresponding documentation. I cannot yet say whether this is mere carelessness or something more deliberate, but I thought you should know." The silence that followed was the longest of my life. The Duke studied me with those cold gray eyes, and I could not read what lay behind them. Then, slowly, his lips curved into something that was not quite a smile. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said, his voice soft and dangerous. "I have employed a dozen accountants in the past 5 years. Each one has assured me that my accounts are in perfect order. Are you suggesting that you, a woman barely out of mourning clothes, have discovered something that all those learned men missed?" "I am suggesting nothing." "Your Grace," I replied, though my heart was pounding so hard I was certain he could hear it. "I am merely reporting what I have observed. The ledger is wrong. Whether that wrongness is the result of incompetence or something worse, I cannot yet say." He laughed then, that laugh that would haunt me for months to come. It was a sound utterly without warmth, a dismissal more cutting than any words could have been. "You are either very brave or very foolish, Mrs. Caldwell," he said. "I suspect the latter. Return to your ledgers and your columns. When you have learned enough to understand how truly ignorant you are, we may speak again." I left his study with my cheeks burning and my hands trembling at my sides. But beneath the humiliation, beneath the anger, there was something else, a cold, clear certainty that I was right. The ledger was wrong. I knew it as surely as I knew my own name. And I would prove it, not for him, not for his approval or his respect, but for my own dignity. For the memory of my father, who had taught me that numbers never lied. And for the woman I was determined to become. A woman who would never again be dismissed or diminished by a man who thought himself her better. That night, I returned to my room and began again. I pulled every ledger from the desk and arranged them in chronological order. I created lists of every sum that did not reconcile, every entry that lacked documentation, every gap and inconsistency I could find. The candle burned low and was replaced with another. The clock in the hall below chimed midnight, then 1, then 2, and slowly, like a picture emerging from fog, I began to see the shape of what had been hidden. The discrepancies were not random. They followed a pattern, always in the same months, always in the same categories of expense. And they all led back to a single name that appeared again and again in the margins, written in a hand different from the rest, a name I did not recognize, but which seemed to carry enormous weight. The name was Blackwood. I did not know then what that name would come to mean. I did not know that it would unlock doors I had never meant to open, reveal secrets that powerful men had killed to protect, and bind me to the Duke of Hartwell in ways I could not have imagined. I knew only that I had found something real, something true, and that I would not rest until I understood what it meant. I fell asleep at my desk as dawn broke over Ravenswood Manor, my head pillowed on a stack of papers covered in my own cramped handwriting. And in my dreams, I heard the Duke's laughter echoing through empty halls, mocking me, challenging me, daring me to prove that I was more than he believed me to be. I would prove it. God help me. I would prove everything. The following weeks passed in a blur of numbers and sleepless nights. I took my meals in my room, barely tasting the food the kitchen maid brought me. I spoke to no one, save Mrs. Pemberton, who regarded my obsessive dedication with a mixture of bewilderment and grudging respect. And I avoided the Duke entirely, though I sometimes felt as though I could sense his presence in the house, cold and watchful, waiting for me to fail. The name Blackwood appeared 17 times in the ledgers, always associated with payments that ranged from £50 to £500. There were no receipts, no contracts, no explanations, just the name and the sum recorded in that distinctive hand. I asked Mrs. Pemberton if she knew the name, and she turned pale and shook her head. "We do not speak of Blackwood," she said, and there was fear in her voice. "Leave it alone, Mrs. Caldwell. Some things are better left undiscovered." But I could not leave it alone. The total of all those payments came to exactly £4,762 over a period of 4 years. Combined with various other discrepancies I had identified, the missing sum approached £5,000. It was a fortune, enough to support a gentleman in comfort for years. And it had simply vanished from the accounts of Ravenswood Manor. On the 23rd of October, I received another summons to the study. The Duke was standing when I entered, his back to the room, staring out the window at the rain that had been falling for 3 days without ceasing. He did not turn when I approached, and for a long moment we stood in silence, two strangers bound together by circumstance and secrets neither of us yet understood. "You wished to see me, Your Grace," I said at last. He turned then, and I was struck again by the severity of his features, the coldness in his eyes. But there was something else there, too, something I had not seen before. He looked tired, I realized, tired and troubled and older than his 32 years. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said, "I have heard that you have been asking questions about matters that do not concern you." My heart quickened, but I kept my voice steady. "If you mean the accounts, Your Grace, they concern me entirely. You hired me to reconcile them." I hired you to record numbers in books, he said, his voice sharp. Not to conduct investigations. Not to interrogate my staff about names you have no business knowing. I felt my temper rise, that dangerous temper my mother had always warned me would be my downfall. Your Grace, I said, and I heard the edge in my own voice. You asked me to explain the discrepancies in your accounts. I have found those discrepancies. £5,000, give or take, has been diverted from your estate over the past 4 years. The payments are all linked to a name, Blackwood, that no one in this house will discuss. If you wish me to ignore this and simply make the numbers balance, I can do so. But I thought you were a man who valued truth over convenience. The silence that followed was terrible. I had gone too far. I knew it even as the words left my lips. The Duke of Hartwell was not a man to be challenged, least of all by a penniless widow with nothing to recommend her but a head for numbers and a tongue too quick for wisdom. But when he spoke, his voice was not angry. It was something else entirely, something raw and pained that I would not understand until much later. £5,000, he repeated softly. You are certain of this? I am certain of the numbers, I said. What they mean, I cannot say. He turned back to the window, and I saw his hands clench at his sides. For a long moment he said nothing, and when he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Blackwood is not a what, Mrs. Caldwell. Blackwood is a who. And the money. He paused, and I saw his shoulders tighten as though bracing for a blow. The money was not stolen. It was paid. A debt I owe and can never fully discharge. A debt measured not in pounds but in blood. I did not understand then. How could I? I was still an outsider, still ignorant of the secrets that haunted this house and the man who ruled it. But I heard the pain in his voice, and I felt something shift between us, some invisible barrier weakening ever so slightly. Your Grace, I began. But he raised a hand to silence me. Enough for tonight, he said. You have found what you were looking for, Mrs. Caldwell. I hope you are prepared for where it leads. He dismissed me then, and I returned to my room with my mind spinning and my heart troubled. I did not sleep that night either. I sat at my window and watched the rain fall over the gardens of Ravenswood Manor, and I wondered what debt could be measured in blood, and what secrets the Duke of Hartwell was hiding behind those cold grey eyes. I would learn soon enough. And when I did, everything I thought I knew about him, about this house, about the nature of guilt and redemption and love itself, would be shattered beyond repair. The name Blackwood became my obsession. It followed me through the corridors of Ravenswood Manor like a ghost, whispered in the rustle of curtains, echoed in the creak of floorboards beneath my feet. A debt measured in blood, the Duke had said, and those words wound themselves around my thoughts until I could think of little else. I should have left it alone. Mrs. Pemberton had warned me, and the Duke himself had made it clear that I was treading on dangerous ground. But I was not built for ignorance. My father had raised me to believe that truth was sacred, that understanding was the highest form of courage. And so, against all wisdom, I continued to search. The answer came, as answers often do, from an unexpected source. Her name was Nell, and she was the youngest of the kitchen maids, a girl of perhaps 16 with copper hair and a spray of freckles across her nose. I had noticed her watching me during my rare appearances in the servants' hall, her eyes curious and unafraid in a way that the older servants' eyes were not. One evening, as I sat alone in the small parlor that had been designated for my use, she appeared at the door with a tray of tea and a nervous smile. "Begging your pardon, Mrs. Caldwell," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "but I heard you've been asking about Blackwood." I set down my pen and studied her face. She was trembling slightly, though whether from cold or fear I could not say. "What do you know about it, Nell?" She glanced over her shoulder, as though expecting someone to materialize from the shadows. "Not much, Mom. Only what my gran told me before she passed. She worked here, you see, 30 years ago. back when the old Duke was master. I felt my pulse quicken. "Go on," I said, keeping my voice gentle so as not to frighten her. Nell stepped into the room and closed the door behind her. "Blackwood was a village," she said. "A small place, maybe 20 families on the northern edge of the estate. The old Duke, he owned all the land, and the people there paid rent to live and farm. But something happened. Gran never said exactly what, only that there was a fire one winter, and most of the village burned. People died, Mom, whole families, and afterward the old Duke had the ruins torn down and the land cleared. He never let anyone speak of it again. A fire." My mind raced through the implications. When did this happen? "Near 20 years ago, Mom. I was not born yet, nor was His Grace much more than a boy. But Gran said he was there that night. She said he saw things no child should see. I sat in silence for a long moment, absorbing this revelation. A village destroyed by fire, people dead. The current Duke, then merely a child, witness to the tragedy. And payments made for years afterward, secret payments recorded in ledgers that were deliberately obscured. A debt measured in blood. "Nell," I said at last, "do you know if anyone from Blackwood survived?" She shook her head. "I do not know, Mom. Gran never said, but she always got a strange look when she spoke of it, like she was afraid even the memory might bring bad luck." She pressed her lips together and looked at the floor. "I should not have told you any of this. Mrs. Pemberton would have my position if she knew. I will not speak of it, I promised. And Nell, thank you. You have been braver than you know." She gave me a quick, uncertain smile and slipped away with her empty tray, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the guttering candle. A village called Blackwood, a fire, deaths, and a secret that had haunted this house for 2 decades. I did not sleep that night. Instead, I searched. The Duke's library was forbidden to the household staff, but I had learned early in my tenure that the servants' corridors connected to nearly every room in the manor through hidden doors designed for discretion. I waited until the clock struck 2, until even the most dedicated footman had retired, and then I made my way through the narrow passages that ran behind the walls. The library was vast and dark, illuminated only by the dying embers in the hearth and the pale moonlight that filtered through tall windows. I moved carefully among the shelves, searching for anything that might shed light on the tragedy Nell had described. Estate records, perhaps, or correspondence from that time. Anything that might explain why a duke would pay thousands of pounds over decades to commemorate a fire that everyone had been forbidden to mention. I found what I was looking for in a locked cabinet behind the desk. The lock was old, and I had learned to pick locks in the desperate months after my husband's death, when creditors came calling and I needed access to his papers to understand the full scope of his betrayal. Within minutes, the cabinet stood open before me, revealing a collection of documents bound in black ribbon. The first was a letter dated March 15th, 1823. It was addressed to the Duke of Hartwell, the current Duke's father, and it was written in a hand that trembled with emotion. "Your Grace," the letter began, "I write to you from the ruins of everything I have ever loved. My wife is dead, my children are dead, my neighbors, my friends, all dead. And for what? For the crime of asking for mercy, for the sin of begging you to reduce our rents during a season when the harvest failed and we had nothing to give." I read on, my hands shaking, my breath coming short. "You sent your men with torches," the letter continued. "You burned us out like vermin, and when we fled into the snow, your men drove us back with dogs and whips. I watched my daughter burn, Your Grace. She was 7 years old. Her name was Mary, and she burned because you wanted to teach us a lesson about obedience. There was more. Pages and pages of grief and rage and accusation." The writer identified himself as Thomas Wren, a tenant farmer of Blackwood Village, the sole survivor of what he called the the Hartwell massacre. He had escaped by hiding in a well, submerged in freezing water while his world turned to ash above him. And he had written this letter not to beg for justice, for he knew none would come, but simply to ensure that somewhere, somehow, the truth would be recorded. "I am dying," the letter concluded. "The cold that night destroyed my lungs, and I have not many months left. But before I go, I wanted you to know that I know what you did. God knows. And one day, Your Grace, your sons will know, and their sons after them. And the name Blackwood will be a curse upon your house until the last Hartwell draws breath." I sat in the darkness of the library, that terrible letter in my hands, and I wept. I wept for Thomas Wren and his daughter Mary. I wept for the families of Blackwood, erased from history by a cruel man's pride. And I wept for the Duke I had come to despise, who had been a child of 12 when his father committed an atrocity, and who had spent his adult life paying a debt he could never discharge, a debt measured in blood. The payments in the ledger were not theft, they were penance. The current Duke had been sending money to someone, perhaps descendants of survivors, perhaps a fund established in the village's memory for years. He had been trying, in his own secret way, to atone for a sin that was not his own. I do not know how long I sat there. The fire died to cold ash. The moon sank below the trees. And when at last I rose to return to my room, I found that I was not alone. The Duke stood in the doorway watching me. He was dressed in a robe of dark blue silk, his feet bare, his hair disheveled as though he had risen from troubled sleep. In the dim light, his face was unreadable, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the tight set of his jaw. He looked at the letter in my hands, and I saw something flicker in his eyes. Pain, perhaps, or resignation, or simply the exhaustion of a man who has carried a burden too heavy for too long. "So," he said quietly, "now you know. I should have been afraid. I had broken into his private library, stolen his most guarded secrets, learned things that could destroy him if they ever came to light. But I felt no fear. I felt only a terrible, overwhelming sadness. "Your Grace," I began, but he raised a hand to silence me. "Do not," he said, and his voice cracked on the word. "Do not offer me comfort or absolution. I do not deserve either, and I will not accept them." "You were a child," I said. "You had no part in what your father did." He laughed then, but it was not the cold, dismissive laugh I had heard before. This laugh was broken, jagged, full of self-loathing. "I was there, Mrs. Caldwell. I stood beside my father and watched Blackwood burn. I heard the screams. I smelled the smoke, and I did nothing. I said nothing. I was a coward then, and I have been a coward every day since." He crossed the room and took the letter from my hands, handling it with the care one might give to a holy relic. "Thomas Wren died 3 months after he wrote this," he said. "I was 15 when I found his letter among my father's papers. I have read it 1,000 times. I know every word by heart, and every word is a knife in my chest." "The payments," I said softly. "You have been sending money to someone, to make amends." He nodded, his eyes fixed on the letter. There were survivors. A handful who escaped, who scattered across the country and tried to forget. I have spent years tracking them down, offering what little restitution I can. Money cannot bring back the dead, Mrs. Caldwell, but it can ease the living at least a little. I looked at him then, truly looked, and I saw him for the first time, not as the cold, arrogant Duke who had laughed at my discovery, but as a man haunted by a past he could not change and a guilt he could not escape. I saw the boy who had watched his father's cruelty and been marked by it forever. And I saw something else, something I had not expected to find in those gray eyes. Loneliness, a loneliness as vast and deep as the sea, kept hidden behind walls of ice and silence. "Why did you hire me?" I asked. "Truly." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he sighed, a sound of such weariness that it seemed to come from his very soul. "Because I knew you would find out," he said. "I have known for months that the ledgers were becoming impossible to conceal. And I thought—" He paused, and something almost like a smile touched his lips. "I thought that if it had to be discovered, better by someone who would understand, someone who had known loss, someone who would not look at me with either fear or pity." "And do I?" I asked. "Look at you with either?" He met my eyes, and I felt the weight of his gaze like a physical touch. "No," he said softly. "You look at me as though I am a problem to be solved. It is strangely refreshing. I did not know what to say to that. I did not know what to feel. This man had mocked me, dismissed me, made me feel small and foolish. And yet, beneath all of that, he had been protecting a secret not out of shame for himself, but out of grief for others. He had been carrying a weight that would have crushed a lesser soul. "What will you do now?" he asked. "You have enough to ruin me if you choose. The scandal would be immense. The great Duke of Hartwell, scion of a family that massacred its own tenants. I would be finished in society." I considered the question carefully. I thought of the power I held, the revenge I could exact if I wished. And I thought of Thomas Wren's letter, of little Mary who burned at 7 years old, of all the ghosts that walked the halls of Ravenswood Manor. "I am not interested in your ruin, Your Grace," I said at last. "I am interested in the truth. And the truth is that you have spent your life trying to repair what your father destroyed. That is not something to be punished. It is something to be honored." He stared at me as though I had spoken in a foreign tongue. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then slowly, he reached out and took my hand. His fingers were cold, his grip tentative, as though he had forgotten how to touch another person with gentleness. "Thank you," he said, and his voice was rough with emotion. "Thank you, Mrs. Caldwell." We stood like that for what felt like hours, his hand in mine, the ghosts of Blackwood watching from the shadows. And in that moment, something changed between us. The wall of ice that had separated us began to crack. The first tender shoots of something new and fragile began to push through the frozen ground. I did not know then what that something would become. I did not know that it would grow into a love so powerful it would reshape both our lives. I knew only that I was no longer alone in this house of secrets, and neither was he. When I finally returned to my room, the first light of dawn was breaking over the gardens. I sat at my window and watched the sun rise, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, and I thought about the strange path that had brought me to this moment. A penniless widow, a forbidden library, a duke haunted by his father's sins, and beneath it all, threading through every twist and turn, the name that would bind us together. Blackwood. I did not know it then, but the discovery I had made was only the beginning. There were more secrets hidden in the walls of Ravenswood Manor, more ghosts waiting to be released, and the greatest revelation of all was yet to come, a truth that would shatter everything I believed about the Duke, about myself, and about the nature of love and redemption. But that is a story for another night. For now, let me simply say that I went to sleep that morning with the Duke's hand still warm in my memory. And when I dreamed, it was not of fire and ashes, but of something far more dangerous. It was of hope. The days that followed our midnight encounter in the library were strange and tentative, like the first fragile moments of spring after a brutal winter. The Duke and I did not speak of what had passed between us. We did not speak much at all, in truth. But something had shifted in the air of Ravenswood Manor, something that even the servants seemed to sense, though they could not name it. I continued my work on the ledgers, but now I understood the patterns I had once found so baffling. The payments to Blackwood survivors, carefully disguised as estate expenses. The missing documentation, destroyed to protect the identities of those who received the funds. The deliberate confusion, designed to hide an act of mercy from those who might condemn it. I reconciled what could be reconciled and left the rest intact, honoring the Duke's secret even as I organized the evidence of it. He came to my small parlor one afternoon, a week after that fateful night. I was bent over my desk, my pen scratching figures into a fresh ledger, and I did not hear him enter until he spoke my name. Mrs. Caldwell. I looked up, startled, and found him standing just inside the doorway. He was dressed for riding, tall boots and a coat of deep green that brought out the silver in his hair. In the daylight, he looked less haunted than he had in the library, though the shadows still lingered in his eyes. "Your Grace," I said, rising from my chair. "Is something wrong?" He shook his head. "No, I merely wish to see how your work progresses." It was a flimsy excuse, and we both knew it. He could have summoned me to his study if he wanted a report. He could have sent a footman with a note. Instead, he had come himself to this cramped room beneath the eaves where no Duke had ever set foot. "The accounts are nearly in order," I said carefully. "Another fortnight, perhaps, and I will have a complete picture of the estate's finances." He nodded, but he did not leave. He stood there, awkward and uncertain, a man who had clearly not spent much time making small talk with women who were not of his station. The silence stretched between us, and I found myself studying his face, searching for some clue to his thoughts. "Your Grace," I said at last. "Was there something else?" He hesitated. Then, with visible effort, he spoke. "I wondered if you might like to see the gardens. They are at their finest in late autumn, before the frost takes hold. And you have been working so hard. A walk might do you good." I stared at him, too surprised to respond. The Duke of Hartwell, cold and proud and untouchable, was asking me to walk with him in the gardens. It was such an ordinary request, and yet it felt monumental, like a door opening onto a room I had never known existed. "I would like that very much," I said. We walked for over an hour that afternoon, through winding paths lined with roses gone to hip and hedges trimmed into fanciful shapes. He told me about his mother, who had designed the gardens before her death when he was 10. He told me about his younger brother, killed in a riding accident at 19. He told me about the weight of being the last of his line, the pressure to marry and produce an heir, the endless parade of simpering debutantes pushed at him by their ambitious mothers. I told him about my father, who had taught me to find beauty in numbers. I told him about my marriage, the hope with which it had begun and the despair with which it had ended. I told him about the creditors who had come for everything, the furniture and the silver, and even my mother's jewelry, leaving me with nothing but debts and shame. We did not speak of Blackwood. We did not need to. That shared knowledge hung between us like a bridge, connecting us across the vast gulf of station and circumstance. For the first time since my husband's death, I felt seen, not pitied or dismissed or patronized, but truly seen as a person of worth and substance. When we returned to the house, the sun was setting and the air had turned cold. The Duke walked me to the foot of the servants' stair, where propriety demanded we part. But before I could climb the first step, he caught my hand. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for walking with me, for listening. I had forgotten what it was like to speak to someone who does not want something from me." I looked down at our joined hands, his so much larger than mine, his skin warm against my cold fingers. "Everyone wants something, Your Grace," I said. "It is the nature of being human." "And what do you want, Mrs. Caldwell?" The question hung in the air between us. I could have given a safe answer, a proper answer. I could have said that I wanted nothing more than to do my job well and earn my wages honestly. But something in his eyes made me speak the truth instead. "I want to matter," I said. "I want my life to have meant something more than a cautionary tale about foolish women who trust the wrong men. I want to be remembered for what I did, not merely for what was done to me." He was silent for a long moment. Then, slowly, he raised my hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to my knuckles. It was a gesture from another era, courtly and formal, and yet it made my heart race in a way that was anything but formal. "You matter," he said, "more than you know." He released my hand and walked away before I could respond. I stood at the foot of those stairs for a long time, my hand still tingling where his lips had touched it, and I wondered what was happening to me. I had sworn never to give my heart to another man. I had built walls around myself, high and thick and impenetrable. And yet here I was, watching those walls crumble at the mere touch of a duke's lips on my skin. I told myself it was nothing, a moment of weakness, born of loneliness and shared secrets. I told myself that a man like him could never truly care for a woman like me, that I was a novelty at best, a distraction at worst. I told myself all the sensible things a woman in my position should think. But late that night, lying in my narrow bed, I could not stop remembering the warmth of his hand, the softness of his voice, the way he had looked at me as though I were something precious and rare. I was falling in love with the Duke of Hartwell. God help me, I was falling, and I did not know how to stop. The Dowager Lady Hartwell summoned me 3 days later. I had seen her only from a distance since my arrival, a tall, severe woman in her 60s who moved through the manor like a ship under full sail. She was the Duke's aunt, his father's elder sister, and she had served as mistress of Ravenswood Manor since his mother's death. The servants feared her even more than they feared the Duke himself, and her word was law in all matters of household management. The summons came through Mrs. Pemberton, who delivered it with a meaningful look that I could not quite interpret. "Her ladyship will see you in the morning room at 11 o'clock, she said. "I would advise you to be punctual and careful." I arrived at precisely 11, my best dress brushed and pressed, my hair pinned with more care than usual. The morning room was bright with winter sunlight, and the dowager sat enthroned in a chair by the window, her silver hair immaculately coiffed, her black silk gown rustling as she turned to examine me. "So," she said, and her voice was cool as marble, "you are the woman who has been walking in my gardens with my nephew." I felt my cheeks flush, but I kept my voice steady. "Yes, my lady. His Grace was kind enough to show me the grounds. Kind." She repeated the word as though it were a foreign language. "My nephew is many things, Mrs. Caldwell, but kind is not among them. He does not invite servants to walk with him in the gardens. He does not take tea with housekeepers or discuss literature with governesses. And yet here you are, a widow of no family and less fortune, and he treats you as though you were his equal." I did not know what to say. The dowager's eyes were sharp as glass, missing nothing, and I felt as though she could see straight through to my racing heart. "I wonder," she continued, leaning forward slightly, "what exactly you imagine will come of this. Do you think he will marry you? Elevate you to his station? Make you the Duchess of Hartwell?" "My lady," I began, but she raised a hand to silence me. "I am not accusing you of scheming," she said. "I have made inquiries about you, Mrs. Caldwell. You are not a fortune hunter or a social climber. You are simply a woman who found herself in an impossible situation and has been trying to survive it with what dignity she can muster. I respect that. But respect does not change the facts." She rose from her chair and crossed to where I stood, her movement slow and deliberate. "My nephew is the Duke of Hartwell," she said. "His bloodline stretches back 500 years. He will marry a woman of appropriate birth and breeding, a woman who can give him heirs and take her place in society without causing scandal. That woman is not you. It can never be you." "I understand, my lady," I said, and my voice did not waver, though my heart was breaking. "Do you?" She studied my face for a long moment. "I wonder. You have a quality about you, Mrs. Caldwell, a certain fire that I suspect my nephew finds appealing. He has always been drawn to things that burn. But fire consumes, and in the end, it is always the woman who is left in ashes. I am telling you this not to be cruel, but to protect you. Walk away now, while you still can, before you are destroyed." She dismissed me then, and I walked back to my room in a daze. Every word she had spoken was true. I knew it was true. The Duke and I existed in different worlds, separated by a chasm that no amount of affection could bridge. To dream otherwise was folly of the most dangerous kind, and yet that afternoon, when he appeared at my door with another invitation to walk, I could not refuse him. And when his hand found mine as we wandered through the bare winter garden, I did not pull away. And when he stopped beneath a skeletal oak tree and looked at me with eyes full of something I dared not name, I let myself believe, just for a moment, that the dowager might be wrong. It was on that walk that he told me about the child. "Her name is Clara," he said, his voice soft with a tenderness I had never heard before. "She is 8 years old. She lives in the village with a family I trust, and I visit her when I can. She does not know who I am to her. She thinks I am merely a kind gentleman who takes an interest in her education." I felt the ground shift beneath my feet. "Your Grace," I said carefully, "are you telling me that you have a daughter?" He nodded, his jaw tight. "She was born out of wedlock. Her mother was a young woman from the village, a seamstress. I was 23 and stupid and selfish. I thought I loved her, but I was too much of a coward to defy my father and marry beneath my station. When she became pregnant, I arranged for her care, promised to provide for the child. And then she died in childbirth, and I was left with a daughter I could never acknowledge, and a guilt I could never escape." He turned away from me, his shoulders bowed as though beneath a great weight. "My aunt does not know. No one knows, except the family who raises her and a solicitor who manages the trust I established for her care. If society were to learn of her existence, she would be branded a bastard and I would be ruined. But she is my child, Mrs. Caldwell, my only child, and I love her more than I have ever loved anything in this world." I stood in silence, absorbing this revelation. Another secret, another burden. This man, who had seemed so cold and untouchable, was in truth a fortress built to protect the vulnerable, holding back a flood of grief and guilt and love that would drown him if he ever let it free. "Have you considered," I said slowly, acknowledging her, legitimizing her somehow? He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "And make her a target for every gossip and scandalmonger in England? Brand her forever as the Duke's bastard? No, she is better off as she is, loved and cared for, free from the burden of my name." "But she does not know her father," I said. "Does that not trouble you?" "It destroys me," he said simply. "Every day, every hour. But my destruction is a small price to pay for her happiness." I looked at him then, this man who had been painted as a villain in every drawing room in the county, and I saw him for what he truly was. A father who would sacrifice everything for his child. A son trying to atone for his father's sins. A man so afraid of causing harm that he had locked himself away from all human connection, preferring loneliness to the risk of hurting someone he loved. "Take me to see her," I said. He turned to stare at me, shock plain on his face. "What?" "Take me to see Clara," I repeated. "I want to meet her. I want to know this part of you that you have hidden from the world." For a long moment, he did not speak. I saw the war playing out behind his eyes, the fear battling with something else, something that looked almost like hope. And then, slowly, he nodded. "Tomorrow," he said. "I will take you tomorrow." That night, I lay awake and thought about what I had learned. A secret daughter, a dead mother, a love that could never be spoken aloud. The Duke of Hartwell was a man of layers, each one revealing new depths of pain and devotion. And I was falling deeper into him with every passing day, losing myself in his secrets, becoming entangled in his life in ways that could only end in heartbreak. The dowager's warning echoed in my mind. Walk away now, while you still can. But it was already too late. I knew that with a certainty that terrified me. Whatever happened next, whatever pain awaited, I could not turn back. My heart had made its choice, and there was nothing to do but follow where it led. Tomorrow, I would meet his daughter. Tomorrow, I would step even further into his world. And tomorrow, I knew, everything would change. The village of Ashmore lay 3 miles from Ravenswood Manor, a quiet collection of stone cottages clustered around an ancient church. The Duke drove us himself in a modest gig, dressed not in his usual finery, but in simple country clothes that made him look almost ordinary, almost approachable. We stopped before a cottage at the edge of the village, whitewashed walls and a garden gone dormant for winter. A woman appeared at the door, middle-aged and kind-faced, and she greeted the Duke with the easy familiarity of long acquaintance. "She is in the parlor, Your Grace," the woman said. "She has been asking about you all morning." The Duke turned to me, and I saw nervousness in his eyes for the first time since I had known him. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said, "this is Mrs. Hewitt, who has raised Clara since she was an infant. Mrs. Hewitt, this is Mrs. Caldwell. She is a friend." The word friend hung in the air between us, inadequate and strange. But Mrs. Hewitt merely nodded and led us inside. Clara was sitting by the fire, a book open in her lap. She was small for her age, with dark hair that curled around her face and gray eyes so like her father's that it made my heart ache. When she saw the Duke, her face lit up with a joy so pure it was almost painful to witness. "Mr. Edmund," she cried, for that was the name he used with her. "You came. You really came." He knelt before her and took her hands in his. "Of course I came, little one. I promised, did I not?" I watched them together, this secret father and his hidden daughter, and I felt tears prick at my eyes. The tenderness between them was unmistakable, a bond forged in stolen moments and whispered promises. And I understood in that moment why he had brought me here. He was not merely showing me his secret. He was trusting me with the thing he loved most in all the world. Clara looked up and noticed me for the first time. "Who is that lady?" she asked, her voice curious and unafraid. The Duke glanced at me, and something passed between us, something wordless and profound. "This is Mrs. Caldwell," he said. "She is my friend, and I hope she will be your friend too." Clara studied me with those serious gray eyes, so much older than her 8 years. "Do you like books, Mrs. Caldwell?" "I do," I said, kneeling beside the Duke so that we were at her level. "What are you reading?" She showed me the book, a collection of fairy tales with beautiful illustrations. "I like the stories about princesses," she said, "but not the ones where they just wait to be rescued. I like the ones where they rescue themselves." The Duke laughed, a real laugh full of warmth and pride. "That is my Clara," he said, "always the heroine of her own story." We spent the afternoon in that little cottage, the 3 of us together. We read stories and played games and ate the gingerbread that Mrs. Hewitt had baked. And when the light began to fade and it was time to leave, Clara hugged her father tightly and made him promise to return soon. "I like her," she whispered to him, glancing at me. "Will you bring her again?" "I will," he said. "I promise." The drive back to Ravenswood Manor was silent, but it was a different kind of silence than before. It was the silence of 2 people who have shared something precious, something that cannot be captured in words. When we reached the house and he helped me down from the gig, he held my hand for a long moment, his eyes searching my face. "Thank you," he said, "for seeing her, for seeing me." I could not speak. I could only nod, my heart too full for words. He raised my hand to his lips, as he had done before, but this time the kiss lingered, and when he looked at me again, I saw something in his eyes that took my breath away. It was love, unmistakable and undeniable. And I knew, with a certainty that both terrified and thrilled me, that he saw the same thing reflected in my own eyes. We stood there in the fading light, 2 people on the edge of something that could save them or destroy them. And though neither of us spoke the words aloud, we both knew that there was no turning back. The walls had fallen, the fortress had been breached, and whatever came next, we would face it together. The winter deepened around Ravenswood Manor, and with it, my entanglement with the Duke grew ever more complete. We walked together nearly every day now, bundled against the cold, our breath making clouds in the frigid air. We took tea in his study, surrounded by books and silence and the comfortable warmth of the fire. We spoke of everything and nothing, of philosophy and poetry and the small details of our days. And though we never touched beyond the press of his lips to my hand, though we never spoke the words that trembled always on the edge of speech, we both knew what was growing between us. I had never been happier, and I had never been more afraid. The Dowager watched us with eyes like a hawk, her disapproval radiating from every glance. She said nothing more to me directly, but I felt her judgment like a weight upon my shoulders, a constant reminder that what I was doing was foolish and dangerous and destined for ruin. I tried to convince myself that she was wrong, that love could conquer the barriers of station and circumstance. But late at night, alone in my narrow bed, I knew the truth. I was a widow with nothing. He was a duke with everything, and the world we lived in would never allow us to be together. It was on the 15th of December that everything began to unravel. I was in my parlor, working on the final pages of the reconciled accounts, when Mrs. Pemberton appeared at my door with a face as white as chalk. "Mrs. Caldwell," she said, and her voice trembled. "You must come at once. There is a gentleman in the entrance hall. He says he knows you. He says he is your brother-in-law." The word struck me like a physical blow. I had no brother-in-law, not anymore. My husband had been an only child, and his parents had died years before I ever met him. But there was one man who might claim such a connection, one man whose existence I had tried desperately to forget. His name was Geoffrey Ashby. He was my late husband's cousin, the man who had inherited what little remained of the Ashby estate after the creditors had taken their share. And he was, without question, the most dangerous person I had ever known. I descended to the entrance hall on legs that felt like water. Geoffrey stood by the great fireplace, warming his hands, dressed in clothes that were just slightly too fine for a man of his modest means. He was handsome, in a cold, calculating way, with sharp features and pale blue eyes that had always reminded me of ice over deep water. When he saw me, he smiled, and that smile sent a chill down my spine. "Vivienne," he said, spreading his arms as though expecting an embrace. "Or should I say, Mrs. Caldwell? I understand you have reclaimed your maiden name. How delightfully unconventional." "Mr. Ashby," I said, keeping my voice steady through sheer force of will. "This is unexpected. Is it?" He raised an eyebrow. "I should think you would be expecting me, given the circumstances. A woman in your position, finding employment in such an illustrious household. Did you really think no one would notice?" I did not understand what he meant. Not then. I only knew that his presence here could mean nothing good, that whatever had brought him to Ravenswood Manor was calculated to cause me harm. Geoffrey had always resented me, had always believed that I had somehow cheated his family by marrying his cousin and then failing to produce an heir before his death. The fact that I had been left penniless and disgraced had not satisfied his spite. If anything, it had only sharpened it. "What do you want, Geoffrey?" He laughed, a sound without warmth. Straight to the point as always. "Very well. I want what you have taken from me, Vivienne. I want what is rightfully mine." "I have taken nothing from you," I said. "You inherited everything, the house, the land, such money as remained. I was left with nothing." "Nothing except the skills your father taught you," he said. "Nothing except the ability to worm your way into the confidence of wealthy men. Tell me, does the Duke know about your past? Does he know what kind of woman you really are?" A voice spoke from behind me, cold and commanding. "Perhaps you should tell me yourself." I turned to find the Duke standing at the foot of the grand staircase, his face expressionless, his gray eyes fixed on Geoffrey with an intensity that made even that brazen man falter. "Your Grace," Geoffrey said, recovering quickly and executing a bow that was just slightly too shallow to be respectful. "Forgive the intrusion. I am Geoffrey Ashby, cousin to Mrs. Caldwell's late husband. I came merely to pay my respects and to ensure that your Grace is aware of certain facts regarding your employee's history." The Duke descended the remaining stairs with deliberate slowness, each step measured and precise. "And what facts would those be, Mr. Ashby?" Geoffrey glanced at me, triumph gleaming in his pale eyes. "Only that Mrs. Caldwell was married to a man who died in disgrace, buried in debt and scandal. That she herself was implicated in his financial ruin, accused by creditors of hiding assets and falsifying records. That she fled London under a cloud of suspicion and has been running ever since." The words hit me like stones. They were lies, twisted versions of the truth designed to paint me in the worst possible light. I had hidden nothing, falsified nothing. I had been the one to discover my husband's debts, the one to face the creditors and answer their questions, the one to surrender everything I owned in a desperate attempt to salvage what honor I could. But Geoffrey did not care about truth. He cared only about destruction. "Is this true, Mrs. Caldwell?" the Duke asked, his voice carefully neutral. I forced myself to meet his eyes. "My husband died in debt," I said. "That is true. The creditors questioned me as they questioned everyone connected to him. But I was cleared of any wrongdoing. I hid nothing. I stole nothing. Mr. Ashby knows this perfectly well." Geoffrey laughed again, cleared by creditors who could find no evidence, not by any court of law. And as for hiding nothing, he reached into his coat and produced a folded paper. "Perhaps your Grace would like to explain this." He handed the paper to the Duke, who unfolded it and read in silence. I watched his face, searching for any sign of what the document contained, but his expression remained impassive. Only his eyes changed, growing colder with each passing moment. "Where did you get this?" he asked at last. "Does it matter?" Geoffrey was practically gloating now. "The question is whether it is genuine, and I assure you, Your Grace, it is. I have had it authenticated by 2 separate experts. The signature is unmistakably Mrs. Caldwell's." The Duke looked at me, and for the first time I saw doubt in his eyes. "Mrs. Caldwell, do you recognize this document?" He handed it to me, and I felt the room spin as I read. It was a letter, dated 3 months before my husband's death, addressed to a moneylender in London. It promised payment of £500 in exchange for a loan to be used for personal expenses. And at the bottom, in handwriting that looked almost exactly like mine, was my signature. "This is a forgery," I said, but my voice sounded weak even to my own ears. "I never wrote this letter. I never signed this document. Someone has copied my hand." "How convenient," Geoffrey said. "A forgery that just happens to appear at the precise moment when you have secured a position of trust in one of the wealthiest households in England. Tell me, Mrs. Caldwell, how much have you stolen from the Duke? How much have you hidden in your accounts?" "I have stolen nothing," I cried. "Your Grace, you must believe me. This document is false. I would never. I could never." The Duke raised a hand, silencing me. "Mr. Ashby," he said, his voice dangerously quiet, "you have made serious accusations against a member of my household. I trust you have proof beyond this single letter." Geoffrey spread his hands. "I have the letter, Your Grace, and I have the testimony of creditors who always suspected that Mrs. Caldwell knew more than she admitted about her husband's finances. If you require more, I am certain it can be arranged." The threat was unmistakable. Geoffrey would manufacture whatever evidence he needed to destroy me. He had clearly spent months planning this, tracking me down, preparing his lies. And now he had me cornered, with no way to prove my innocence against accusations that were impossible to disprove. The Duke studied Geoffrey for a long moment. Then he turned to me, and his face was unreadable. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said, "please return to your rooms. I will speak with Mr. Ashby privately." "Your Grace?" I began, but he shook his head. "Go," he said, "now." I had no choice but to obey. I climbed the stairs with leaden feet, feeling Geoffrey's triumphant gaze boring into my back. When I reached my room, I closed the door and collapsed against it, my whole body shaking with fear and fury. I did not know what Geoffrey wanted. Money, perhaps, or simply the satisfaction of destroying me. But I knew that if the Duke believed his lies, everything I had built here would be lost. My position, my reputation, whatever fragile hope of happiness I had begun to nurture, all of it would crumble to dust. I spent the next hours in agony, pacing my small room, unable to eat or rest or think clearly. The light faded outside my window. The house grew quiet, and still no word came from below. It was nearly midnight when the knock finally sounded at my door. I opened it to find the Duke standing in the corridor, a candle in his hand, his face half in shadow. He looked exhausted, the lines around his eyes deeper than I had ever seen them. "May I come in?" he asked. I stepped aside, and he entered, setting the candle on my writing desk. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. I could not bear to ask the question that trembled on my lips, and he seemed to be gathering his thoughts, choosing his words with care. "I sent Mr. Ashby away," he said at last. My heart contracted. "And the accusations?" He looked at me then, and I saw something in his eyes that I had not expected. Not doubt, not suspicion. Something else entirely. "I do not believe them," he said simply. The relief that flooded through me was so intense it made me dizzy. I reached out to steady myself against the desk, and he was there in an instant, his hand on my arm, his body close to mine. "I know what Geoffrey Ashby is," he continued. "I made inquiries while you were up here. He is a man of debts and grudges, known throughout London as a schemer and a liar. His accusations were designed to extort money from me in exchange for his silence. When I refused to pay, he threatened to spread his lies throughout society." I closed my eyes. "Then I am ruined." "No." His voice was fierce, and his grip on my arm tightened. "You are not ruined." I told him that if he spoke a single word against you, I would use every ounce of my influence to destroy him. I told him that you were under my protection and that anyone who harmed you would answer to me. He left an hour ago, and I do not believe he will trouble you again." I opened my eyes and found his face inches from mine. "Your Grace," I whispered, "why would you do this for me?" He did not answer with words. Instead, he cupped my face in his hands and kissed me. It was not a gentle kiss, not careful or tentative. It was the kiss of a man who had been holding himself back for weeks, who had finally reached the end of his restraint. I felt the desperation in it, the longing, the fierce possessive hunger that matched my own. And I kissed him back with everything I had, all the fear and hope and love that had been building inside me since the first moment I saw his face. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathing hard. He rested his forehead against mine, his eyes closed, his hands still framing my face. "I love you," he said, and the words sounded as though they had been torn from somewhere deep inside him. "I have loved you since the night you stood in my library and looked at me without fear. I have loved you through every walk in the garden, every conversation by the fire, every moment of every day since you came into my life. And I do not care what the world says, or what my aunt says, or what anyone says. I love you, Vivienne, and I will not lose you." I felt tears streaming down my cheeks. "I love you too," I said. "God help me. I love you more than I ever thought possible." He kissed me again, softer this time, and I let myself believe, just for that moment, that everything would be all right. That love could conquer all obstacles, that we could find a way to be together despite everything that stood between us. But even as I surrendered to his embrace, A small, cold voice whispered in the back of my mind. Geoffrey Ashby had been sent away, but he had not been defeated. The Dowager still watched from the shadows, waiting for her chance to strike. And the world we lived in did not forgive those who defied its rules. The battle was not over. It had only just begun. And the greatest test of our love was still to come. 3 days later, the Dowager made her move. I was summoned to the morning room once again, but this time the Duke was there as well. He stood by the window, his face pale and set, and I knew immediately that something terrible had happened. The Dowager sat in her usual chair, a letter in her hand and a look of grim satisfaction on her face. "I have written to Lady Pembroke," she announced without preamble. "She is an old friend and a woman of impeccable connections. She has agreed to sponsor Miss Catherine Fairfax for the season, with the understanding that my nephew will pay her particular attention." I felt the blood drain from my face. Miss Catherine Fairfax was the daughter of an earl, young and beautiful, and everything that I was not. A suitable match for a duke in every possible way. "Aunt," the Duke said, his voice tight with controlled anger, "we have discussed this." "We have discussed nothing," the Dowager replied. "You have refused to listen to reason, and I have been forced to take matters into my own hands. This infatuation with Mrs. Caldwell is destroying you. It is destroying this family, and I will not stand by and watch everything I have worked for be thrown away on a penniless widow who is not fit to polish your boots. Vivian is worth 10 of any woman you might parade before me," the Duke said. "I will not marry Catherine Fairfax or anyone else you choose." The Dowager's eyes glittered dangerously. "Then you leave me no choice. I have also written to the trustees of the estate. I have informed them of your intention to bring scandal upon the family name, and I have petitioned them to review your fitness to manage the Hartwell fortune." The silence that followed was deafening. The Duke went very still, his face draining of what little color remained. "You would not dare," he said. "I would dare anything to protect this family," she replied. "You may be the Duke, but I am the keeper of our legacy, and I will not see it destroyed by your foolish passion for an unsuitable woman." She rose from her chair and swept toward the door, pausing only to deliver one final blow. "You have 1 month," she said. "Marry Miss Fairfax or face the consequences. The choice is yours." She left us alone in the ringing silence of the morning room. I stood frozen, unable to move or speak, my heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. The Duke crossed the room and took my hands in his. His grip was fierce, almost painful, but I welcomed the pain. It reminded me that this was real, that I was not dreaming. "I will not marry her," he said. "I do not care what my aunt threatens. I will not give you up." But I looked into his eyes, and I saw the truth that he was trying to hide. The trustees had power over his fortune. If they deemed him unfit, they could strip him of everything: the estate, the title, even Clara's trust fund. Everything he had worked to protect would be lost. Because of me. "You must," I said, and each word was a knife in my own heart. "You must marry her." "No." "Think of Clara," I said. "Think of what will happen to her if you lose everything. Think of Blackwood, of the people you are trying to help. You cannot sacrifice all of that for me." "I can," he said fiercely. "I will." But I shook my head, and I felt the tears begin to fall again. "I will not let you," I said. "I love you too much to let you destroy yourself for my sake." I pulled my hands from his and stepped back, putting distance between us, even as every fiber of my being screamed to stay. "I will leave Ravenswood Manor," I said. "Tonight. It is the only way." "Vivienne? No." But I was already moving toward the door. I could not look at him, could not bear to see the anguish on his face. If I looked, I would weaken. And I could not afford to be weak. "Forgive me," I whispered. And I walked out of the morning room, out of his life, leaving my heart behind in the hands of the man I loved. I left Ravenswood Manor as I had arrived, with a single trunk and a heart full of grief. But this time, the grief was of my own making, and that made it infinitely worse. Mrs. Pemberton arranged a carriage for me without question, though I saw the sympathy in her eyes as she handed me a small bundle of food for the journey. The other servants watched from windows and doorways, silent witnesses to my departure. I did not look back as the carriage pulled away from the great house. I could not bear to see it receding behind me, taking with it everything I had come to love. I had no plan, no destination. I had saved a modest sum from my wages, enough to sustain me for a few months if I was careful. Beyond that, I could not think. The future stretched before me like a vast gray emptiness, devoid of hope or purpose. The carriage took me to the coaching inn at Ashmore, where I intended to catch the morning stage to London. I would find work there somehow, lose myself in the crowds of the city, become invisible once more. It was all I knew how to do. I spent that night in a small room above the inn, lying awake in the darkness, listening to the wind howl outside my window. I thought of the Duke, alone in his great house, bound by duty and expectation to a future he did not want. I thought of Clara, who would grow up never knowing that she had been loved by a woman who was not her mother. I thought of all the paths my life might have taken and how each one seemed to lead to this same lonely end. Somewhere in the small hours of the morning, I finally slept. And in my dreams, I walked through the gardens of Ravenswood Manor, searching for something I could not name, calling out to someone who never answered. I woke to the sound of hoofbeats. At first, I thought I was still dreaming. The gray light of dawn was just beginning to filter through the curtains, and the world seemed suspended between night and day. But the hoofbeats were real, growing louder, accompanied by the sound of a carriage rattling into the inn yard below. I rose and went to the window, my heart pounding with a hope I did not dare acknowledge. And there, stepping down from a carriage still steaming from a hard ride, was the Duke of Hartwell. He looked up at my window as though he had known exactly where to find me. Our eyes met across the distance, and even from here I could see the determination written on his face. He strode into the inn without hesitation, and moments later, I heard his boots on the stairs. I opened the door before he could knock. He stood in the narrow corridor, his hair disheveled, his clothes rumpled from travel, his chest heaving with exertion. He looked nothing like a duke, and everything like a man who had ridden through the night to find the woman he loved. "You left," he said, and there was accusation in his voice, but also something else. Something raw and desperate. "I had to," I replied, "for your sake, for Clara's sake." He stepped into the room and closed the door behind him. "Do not presume to know what is for my sake," he said. "Do not presume to make decisions for me as though I were a child who cannot see the consequences of his own choices." "The trustees," I began. But he cut me off. "The trustees can go to the devil," he said fiercely. I spent the night in my study, going through every document, every contract, every legal provision that governs the Hartwell estate. My aunt was bluffing, Vivian. The trustees have no power to strip me of my title or my fortune, unless I am proven to be of unsound mind or guilty of a criminal act. Marrying a woman beneath my station may be scandalous, but it is not grounds for removal. I stared at him, afraid to believe what I was hearing. "But your aunt said—" "My aunt says many things," he replied, "most of them designed to manipulate and control. She has spent 20 years trying to shape me into the Duke she believes I should be, but I am done being shaped. I am done living my life according to her expectations or society's expectations or anyone else's expectations but my own." He took my hands in his, and I felt the warmth of his touch spread through my cold fingers. "I love you, Vivienne," he said. "I have told you this before, but I will say it again, as many times as necessary, until you believe it. I love you, and I want to marry you, and I do not care what the world thinks." Tears were streaming down my face now, but I made no move to wipe them away. You would give up everything, I whispered. Your place in society, your reputation. Your aunt will never forgive you. I am not giving up anything that matters, he said. Society is a collection of hypocrites and gossips. My reputation is built on my father's atrocities. And my aunt, he paused, and a strange expression crossed his face. My aunt may surprise you yet. What do you mean? He reached into his coat and withdrew a letter. This was waiting for me when I returned to the house last night, he said. I think you should read it. I took the letter with trembling hands and unfolded it. The handwriting was elegant and precise, unmistakably feminine. My dear nephew, the letter began. I have spent the night in contemplation, and I find that I must write to you before my courage fails me. What I did today was wrong. I knew it was wrong even as I did it, but I was afraid. Afraid of change, afraid of scandal, afraid of losing the only family I have left. These fears have made me cruel, and for that, I am deeply sorry. I looked up at the Duke, my eyes wide. He nodded for me to continue. I have watched you these past weeks with Mrs. Caldwell, the letter went on. I have seen the way you look at her, the way you smile when she enters a room, the way the weight seems to lift from your shoulders when you are in her company. I have not seen you happy, truly happy, since you were a boy. And I realized, as I sat alone in my room tonight, that my opposition to this match has nothing to do with protecting the family and everything to do with my own selfish desire to maintain control. Mrs. Caldwell is not the wife I would have chosen for you. She is not wealthy or titled or connected, but she is intelligent and brave and honest, and she loves you in a way that no debutante hunting for a title ever could. She challenged you when others cowered. She uncovered our darkest secrets and chose to stay. She is, in short, exactly the kind of woman this family needs. I withdraw my objections. Marry her if she will still have you after the way I have treated her. And tell her, please, that I am sorry. I hope that in time she may come to forgive an old woman who was too proud to admit she was wrong. The letter was signed simply, Your Aunt, Helena. I could not speak. I could only stand there, the letter clutched in my hands, tears falling freely onto the paper. She came to me just before dawn, the Duke said quietly. She had been up all night, writing and rewriting that letter. She told me that she had been wrong, that she had let fear and pride blind her to what truly mattered. And she told me to find you before it was too late. I looked up at him, and through my tears I saw him smiling. It was a real smile, warm and open and full of hope, and it transformed his face from severe to beautiful. Marry me, he said, not because it is convenient or advantageous or expected. Marry me because I love you, and because I cannot imagine spending another day of my life without you by my side. I thought of all the reasons I should refuse, the scandal that would follow us, the whispers and pointed fingers, the long, difficult road of building a life together against the currents of society. I thought of all of it, and I found that none of it mattered. Yes, I said. Yes, I will marry you. He kissed me then, right there in that modest room above a country inn, with the dawn light streaming through the window and the sound of the waking world rising around us. And in that kiss, I felt all the walls I had built around my heart finally crumble to dust. We were married 3 weeks later in the small chapel at Ravenswood Manor. It was not the grand society wedding that a duke might have been expected to have. There were no hundreds of guests, no elaborate decorations, no weeks of celebration. There was only family, such as it was, and a few trusted servants who had become like family over the months I had spent in the house. The dowager was there, seated in the front pew, her face composed and unreadable. She had kept her word, withdrawing her objections and accepting my presence in the household with a dignity that I could not help but admire. We were not yet friends, she and I, but we had reached an understanding. She respected my strength, and I respected hers. It was enough, for now. Perhaps in time, it would become something more. Clara was there too. The Duke had made his decision the day after our engagement. He would acknowledge her publicly, consequences be damned. He had hidden her for 8 years out of fear and shame, and he would hide her no longer. She was his daughter, his only child, and she deserved to know her father. The announcement had caused exactly the scandal we had anticipated. The newspapers had feasted on it for weeks, speculating and moralizing and condemning. Society matrons had clutched their pearls and declared the Duke ruined beyond redemption. Invitations had been withdrawn, alliances severed, doors closed. And the Duke had not cared, not one bit. Clara stood beside us at the altar, her small hand clasped in her father's, her gray eyes shining with a joy that made my heart ache. She had accepted me without hesitation, this child who had never known a mother's love. "I am glad you are going to be my new mama," she had said on the day we met again after the engagement. "Papa smiles so much more when you are here." I had wept then, and I wept again now, as the vicar spoke the words that would bind us together forever. I wept for all the years of loneliness and struggle, for the husband who had betrayed me and the society that had abandoned me. I wept for the woman I had been when I first arrived at Ravenswood Manor, broken and desperate and convinced that happiness was something that happened to other people. And I wept for joy, because against all odds, I had found my way home. The reception was held in the great hall, beneath chandeliers that sparkled with candlelight and windows that looked out over the winter gardens. There was music and laughter and more food than any of us could eat. The servants who had become my friends celebrated alongside us, their faces bright with genuine happiness. At some point in the evening, the Duke led me out onto the terrace, where the cold air bit at our cheeks and the stars wheeled overhead in their endless dance. We stood in silence for a long moment, looking out over the grounds that were now, impossibly, my home. "There is something I want to show you," he said at last. He led me through the darkened gardens, past the skeletal oaks and the dormant rose beds, to a small clearing I had never seen before. In the center of the clearing stood a stone marker, simple and unadorned, bearing a single word: Blackwood. "This is where they are buried," he said quietly, "the few whose bodies were recovered from the fire. I had this marker placed 5 years ago, when I first learned the truth of what my father had done. I come here sometimes to remember, to remind myself why I must be better than he was." I reached out and took his hand. "You are better," I said. "You have spent your life trying to make amends for sins that were not your own. You have given everything you have to protect those who cannot protect themselves. Your father was a monster, but you are a good man, the best man I have ever known." He turned to look at me, and in the moonlight his eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I do not deserve you," he said. "Perhaps not," I replied with a small smile. "But you have me nonetheless, and I intend to spend the rest of my life making certain you never forget how much you are loved." He pulled me into his arms, and we stood there in the cold and the dark, 2 wounded souls who had somehow found healing in each other. The ghosts of Blackwood watched from their unmarked graves, but they did not frighten me. They were part of our story now, part of the legacy we would carry forward together. We would not forget them. We would honor their memory by building something better, something kinder, something worthy of the second chance we had been given. The months that followed were not easy. Society did not forgive quickly, and there were many who never forgave at all. We were excluded from balls and parties, whispered about in drawing rooms, held up as an example of everything that could go wrong when passion was allowed to triumph over propriety. But we had each other, and we had Clara, and we had the quiet satisfaction of knowing that we had chosen love over fear. The payments to the Blackwood survivors continued, now openly acknowledged as a charitable fund in memory of the victims. The Dowager, true to her word, accepted me as her nephew's wife, and over time came to regard me with something approaching affection. and Ravenswood Manor, that great house that had once seemed so cold and forbidding, became a home filled with warmth and laughter and the patter of small feet. For Clara was not to remain an only child for long. I discovered I was with child in the spring, and our son was born on a golden September afternoon, with the harvest moon rising over the fields and the sound of celebration echoing through the halls. We named him Thomas, after the man whose letter had first revealed the truth of Blackwood, and as I held him in my arms for the first time, I felt the last broken piece of my heart finally slide into place. I had come to Ravenswood Manor with nothing, a widow with a ruined reputation and a single trunk containing everything she owned. I had expected nothing more than a chance to survive, to earn my wages and keep my head down and fade quietly into obscurity. Instead, I had found a family, a purpose, a love so deep and true that it had transformed not only my life, but the lives of everyone it touched. "The ledger is wrong," I had whispered on that first day, and the Duke had laughed. But I had been right. The ledger was wrong, and in proving it, I had uncovered not only a fortune, but a future. Not only a secret, but a soul. Sometimes, late at night, when the children are asleep and the house is quiet, I walk through the gardens of Ravenswood Manor and think about all the paths that led me here. The father who taught me to find truth in numbers. The husband who betrayed me, and in doing so, set me free. The Duke who looked at me with cold eyes and a colder heart until I showed him that beneath the ice there was still something worth saving. I think about Blackwood, and the lives that were lost there, and the debt that can never be fully repaid. I think about Clara, growing tall and strong, learning to be the heroine of her own story. I think about Thomas in his cradle, and the world he will inherit, and the man I hope he will become. And I think about love, that most mysterious and powerful of forces, which can turn strangers into family and enemies into friends and broken hearts into whole ones. The ledger of my life was wrong for so many years. The numbers did not balance. The columns did not align. There was always something missing, some crucial figure that I could not find, no matter how hard I searched. But now, at last, the ledger is right. The accounts are settled, the debts are paid, and the balance, against all odds and expectations, is love. This is the end of my story, though it is also, in many ways, the beginning. The beginning of a new chapter, a new life, a new legacy built on the ashes of the old. I do not know what the future holds, but I know that I will face it with my husband at my side and my children in my arms, and the memory of all those who came before lighting my way. I am Vivian Caldwell, once Ashby, now and forever Hartwell. I am a wife and a mother and a keeper of accounts. I am a woman who was broken and rebuilt herself, who was silenced and found her voice, who was dismissed and proved herself worthy. I am the Duchess of Hartwell, and I am finally, blessedly, irrevocably home.